I was always afraid of silence. It came when someone left, when the door closed, when the sound of footsteps faded in the hallway, when the last message stayed unread. It sat beside me like an uninvited guest and said nothing, but so loudly it was unbearable. I used to live in noise. On purpose. I'd play music even when I wasn't listening to it, just so something was playing. The TV hummed in the background. The street buzzed outside the window. People called, texted, invited me out. I was among others. And it felt like this was life, movement, voices, plans. I was afraid to be alone. Not because of loneliness, like I used to think, but because of meeting myself. The moment silence came near, I couldn't pretend anymore. Couldn't hide. There were no mirrors in the silence. Only the real me. Without the smile. Without the confidence. Without an answer to the main question. Who are you, really? In the silence, the things I had buried began to speak. Exhaustion. Insecurity. The fear of being unnecessary. Wounds that should have healed long ago but still bled at the slightest memory. I listened to myself and didn't recognize what I heard. It wasn't the voice I used with others. Not the one I used to write motivational posts or laugh in company. It was my real voice. Broken, muted, forgotten. I had lived in a loud world where everyone had something to say. I was praised, criticized, invited, abandoned, and I constantly tried to respond. To be enough. To be on time. To be okay. I didn't know what it meant to just be. Without expectations. Without validation. Everything changed one evening. There was no dramatic moment. No one yelled, "I'm leaving." No dishes were broken. No doors slammed. It was just silence. Deep, slow, like water filling the empty space after a ship has left port. I was simply left alone. And there was nowhere to run. Friends were busy. Work was postponed. Plans were canceled. My phone was quiet. And so was I. At first, I panicked. The usual. I need to do something. Turn on a show. Call someone. Scroll through socials. Escape. But something stopped me. I don't know what. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe curiosity. Or maybe I just didn't have the strength to pretend anymore. I sat on the floor in my room. Not the comfy couch. Not the bed. The floor. Hard, cool, real. And I just sat there. No thoughts. No plans. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to belong to no one. Not a son. Not a friend. Not a partner. Not an employee. Not a fun conversationalist. Just me. And then she came again. Silence. But this time, she didn't scare me. She was different. Not hostile. Not empty. She was like a new language. Silence without fear. Silence where you could finally hear what had long been muted. I breathed slowly. And with every exhale, something let go. All the things I was clinging to, resentment, expectations, habits, began to fall away. I didn't try to release them. They just did. Because in silence, there's no room for the unnecessary. Was I lonely? Yes. But not like before. It was a different kind of loneliness. Not the no one loves me kind, but the finally, I can just be with myself kind. I thought it would be a one-time thing. That one quiet evening would be enough. That I'd go back to the usual noise, conversations, notifications. But something had changed. I started noticing that I no longer sought company. I didn't run to someone just to feel filled. For the first time in years, I didn't want to escape. And that scared me. Because if I didn't need anyone, what was wrong with me? We're taught that needing others is a sign of normalcy. A person is supposed to be social, supposed to want to be with someone, supposed to have a circle, a partner, a crew. Only then are they part of the world. But I began to doubt that. Not because I stopped valuing people, but because I realized, if I don't learn to be with myself, I'll never be able to truly be with someone else. Because I'll always bring them emptiness. Always expect them to save me, to fill me, to fix me. But that's not their job. In silence, I saw myself for the first time, not as a victim of circumstances, but as the creator of my own space. I realized not everyone who left was bad, and not everyone who stayed was truly mine. Sometimes people disappear not because something's wrong with you, but because their path is simply different. And in the silence, that didn't feel like a tragedy. It felt honest. I went through old photos, revisited memories, paused on moments I had once tried to erase. It hurt. A lot. But in a different way. It wasn't the pain of vulnerability. It was the pain of cleansing. Like pulling out a splinter that had lived in you for years. I started writing again. Not poems. Not posts. Just thoughts. Without a goal. without meaning, just to let out what had been stuck inside. And among all the confusion, things began to appear, things I hadn't noticed before. I remembered that as a child, I loved to draw, and that the last time I held a pencil was maybe 10 years ago. So I bought a simple notebook, colored pencils, sat on the floor, just like I did in the first part of this story, and I began. My hands trembled, not from nerves, from unfamiliarity, because for the first time in a long while, I was doing something not for anyone else, not to impress, not to get likes, just because I wanted to. It felt like meeting myself for the first time, not the version I crafted for others, but the part of me that had been silent all this time. And she wasn't sad. She was full of light, gentle, alive. But, and this is important, I didn't become happy right away. This wasn't a story of overnight transformation. The next day, I woke up with the same emptiness inside. I reached for my phone again. I wanted to text someone, even just, hey, just to make something happen. And I did. I got a reply, but it wasn't the one I was hoping for. Not saving, not warm, just a reply. And that's when I realized I wasn't waiting for people. I was waiting for myself, waiting for the day I could finally endure my own presence. Without roles, without pretense, without the shadow of someone else. And this time, I didn't run. I walked outside without music in my headphones. It felt strange to hear the city, people, myself. Everything that used to feel like background noise came to life. The wind became a sound, the light an event, the pause, not a failure, but a space to breathe. And I walked, thinking, what if silence isn't the absence of sound, but its depth? Maybe that's where the real things are born. I didn't notice the change in me right away. It didn't happen with a bang or an inner explosion. It was a series of small shifts, like the slow arrival of spring after a long winter. I no longer felt the urge to reply instantly. I didn't cling to every message like a lifeline. I learned to be silent and not feel guilty about it. Learned to disappear from conversations and not explain why. Because now, there was someone inside me I didn't want to lose. Myself. And yet, even with this newfound inner quiet, my heart was still alive. It beat. It remembered. And deep down, it still longed to try being with someone again. Not out of need, but out of presence. I met her by chance, at an art exhibit. I almost never went to events. But something drew me in that day. Maybe it was the poster that read, "Silence is also a language." That struck me. Now I knew it was true. She was standing near a painting that held more air than color. At first, I looked at the canvas, then at her. She didn't move. She just was. Strongly, quietly, like the silence I had been learning to accept. We started talking. Not right away. First a glance, then a gentle, "What does this painting remind you of?" Then laughter, then coffee, then a silence that didn't need to be filled. She didn't ask what I did for a living. Didn't say, "We should hang out sometime." She simply existed, in the same silence that had become my comfort. And that terrified me, because I had just learned to be alone. And now, here was someone who wanted to be near. What if I lost myself again? I thought for days about whether I should continue. Wrote messages, then deleted them. Thoughts swirled. What if she becomes the one you run from yourself for? But something in me had already changed. I was no longer someone who clung. I had become someone who chooses. And so I wrote to her. Simply, "Hi, thank you for that evening." It felt very calm, very honest, very alive. "If you feel the same, I'd love to see you again." She replied briefly, but in every word, there was warmth. I felt it too. We saw each other again. Not often, not out of obligation, only when we both truly wanted to. We'd walk in silence, and I noticed something. In her presence, my silence didn't disappear, it expanded. It deepened. It became a space for two. I no longer feared losing myself near someone, because now I knew. You can be with someone and not dissolve. You can hold your own hand and still extend the other to someone walking beside you. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself to feel tenderness. Not the kind born of pressure, not the kind that demands something in return, but the kind that simply is, like sunlight through clouds, unexpected, gentle, real. And most importantly, I realized, true closeness doesn't begin when someone fills you. It begins when they don't break you, when they don't try to change or save you, but accept you fully, even with your silence. Life is a strange thing. Just when you start to believe you're moving forward, it throws something from the past at you, to test you. Have you really grown? Have you truly let go? I hadn't seen her in years. We broke up back when I still didn't know how to be silent. When every argument felt like a battle. When I still thought love meant attachment pushed to the point of pain. She cheated. I broke. We were silent. Then we screamed. And then, we parted, never really understanding who hurt whom more. I thought she was gone from my world forever. And then, a random encounter. The city is big, but not that big. I was walking with a coffee in hand, lost in thought. And there she was, standing near a bookstore. Same posture, same eyes. Something inside me froze. I could have walked past, pretended not to notice. But I couldn't. Not because I wanted her back, but because something inside me rose up, a wave that needed to be released. Hi, I said. She turned, saw me, and in her eyes, no shock, no pain, just silence, just like in me. Hi, she replied. We stood in silence for a moment. And in that quiet, all our past chaos, now without the flames. You look good, she said. I'm learning, I replied. To be myself, to be calm. She smiled, but her eyes, a little misty. She must have had her own journey after us. Life is a strange thing. Just when you start to believe you're moving forward, it throws something from the past your way. To test you. Have you really grown? Have you truly let go? I hadn't seen her in years. We parted back when I still didn't know how to stay silent. When every argument felt like war. When I still believed love was attachment stretched to the point of pain. She betrayed me. I broke. We were silent. Then we screamed. And then, we split, never quite figuring out who hurt whom more. I thought she had disappeared from my world forever. Until, a chance encounter. The city is big, but not that big. I was walking with a coffee in hand, lost in thought, when I saw her. She stood outside a bookstore. Same posture, same eyes. Something inside me froze. I could have walked past, pretended not to notice. But I couldn't. Not because I wanted her back, but because something inside rose up, something that needed to be released. Hi, I said. She turned, saw me, and in her eyes, not shock, not pain, just silence, like in mine. Hi, she replied. We stood quietly for a minute. In that silence lived all our old chaos, now without the fire. You look well, she said. I'm learning, I answered, and added, to be myself, to be at peace. She smiled, but her eyes were slightly wet. Maybe she, too, had her own path after us. Maybe a long one. And like me, she had learned to live without the war. Were you angry at me for a long time? She suddenly asked. I sighed. There was no resentment in that silence anymore. But there was something I had been afraid to admit before. I wasn't angry at you. I was angry at myself. For letting myself be broken. For mistaking dependence for love. For not knowing how to walk away sooner. She nodded. And for the first time, I think she truly saw me. Not the person I was beside her, but the one I had become after her. I've changed too, she said softly. Back then, I was looking for something in others that I lacked in myself. And I destroyed everything that gave me a chance to grow. It was a conversation between two people who had been through the storm and survived. Not together, but because of each other. We didn't go for coffee. We didn't exchange numbers. It wasn't a meeting to restart, but to complete. Like a final full stop I hadn't dared place before. I walked on. And strangely, I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel pain. I felt relief. And even a little gratitude. For the fact that she existed. For the fact that she left. For the fact that I learned to hold myself. That evening I saw the girl from the gallery again. We sat silently on a park bench. I didn't tell her about the meeting. But she looked at me and said, "You feel lighter today. I can see it in your eyes." And I understood. She felt it. Because real closeness doesn't ask what happened. It simply stays when needed. I used to think loneliness began with loss, with betrayal, with a breakup, with a goodbye. But now, listening more closely to myself, I realize it started much earlier. In childhood, back when silence first became not a choice, but a norm. I remembered how in our family, it wasn't customary to talk about feelings. We lived together, but it felt like we were all far apart. Each in our own room, with our own pain, with our own fear of being misunderstood. Mom stayed silent when things got hard. Dad, even more so. I saw how everything inside them was burning, but they seemed not to notice the fire. And I, too, learned to stay silent. Not to cry, not to scream, not to ask why, not even to say, "I love you," because it felt unnecessary. Silence was currency, and I collected it like treasure. I remember the first time I felt like I didn't matter. Not because of something said, but because of what wasn't said. I came home from school with a drawing. Showed it to my mom. She nodded, said, "Well done," then turned back to the pot on the stove. And I stood there holding that paper, silently asking, "See me?" But I was no longer seen. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. And now, as an adult, I carried that feeling with me. Into every relationship, every encounter, every silence. I kept hoping someone would finally say, "I see you." But no one can give what they haven't given to themselves. That realization came the day I called my mother. Just because. No reason. She was surprised. We talked about the weather, the news, small things. But at the end, I gathered my courage and said, "Mom, thank you for enduring it all. I understand now how hard it was. And I forgive you for the silence. But I want you to know, I've learned how to speak." There was silence on the other end. Long, but not empty. And then I heard her inhale and whisper. I didn't know how to do it differently. No one taught me. I just wanted you to be strong. I used to think that the hardest thing was to forgive. To forgive those who caused pain. Those who left. Those who gave no explanation. But no, the hardest thing is to love. Not someone else. Yourself. It's a strange thing. Not to hate yourself. Not to belittle. Not to devalue. But simply to see. And to accept. With all your scars. With all the gaps. With all the poor choices. For a long time, I wasn't there for myself. I existed for others. For how they perceived me. For their expectations. For their version of love, whatever that was. I gave, so I wouldn't be left. I sacrificed, so I'd be validated. I stayed silent, so I wouldn't scare them off. I bent, so they'd hold on to me. And the longer I lived like that, the less of me remained. Until one morning I woke up and realized, I can't do this anymore. Not because someone left. Not because the world grew harsher, but because I could no longer bear myself. I looked in the mirror and saw the eyes of someone exhausted. Someone tired of wearing a mask. I remembered something a therapist once wrote. Learn to talk to yourself the way you talk to someone you love. And I tried. For the first time. "Hey," I said to myself. "I know you're tired. And I believe you. I won't force you to be perfect anymore." They were simple words. But something inside me trembled. Like the parts one had long rejected, had finally been invited back in. I started speaking to myself like a friend. When I made mistakes, I didn't scold, I understood. When I felt sad, I didn't force myself to stay strong. I allowed the sadness. When old patterns returned, I didn't shame myself. I said, "This is you too, and you're allowed to be imperfect." I learned to say to myself, "I'm with you," even when everything else was falling apart. And you know what happened? When I stopped demanding love, it arrived. When I stopped chasing, someone appeared who stayed, even in silence. And I finally said those words, "I love you," not in hope of being loved back, but with peace in my heart. Quiet. Whole. I said it not because I was afraid of losing, but because I felt I had something to give. Because now, I had a love I'd given to myself. It wasn't some romantic fantasy. It was a quiet, honest care. I became more gentle, not just with others, but with me. I started sleeping better. Eating when I was hungry, going for walks for no reason, pausing when I was tired, saying no when I wasn't ready, saying yes when I wanted to, even if it scared me. I learned not to ask for love, but to be loved, and it changed everything. I no longer needed to prove I was worthy. I knew I was. One evening, I sat on the rooftop of my building. It was quiet. The city breathed beneath me. I inhaled the fresh air and said aloud, "I love you, and thank you for being." This morning, there was no music. I didn't turn anything on, didn't grab my phone, didn't look for noise to drown out the silence. I just sat there with a cup of coffee and listened to the quiet. It was no longer emptiness. It had become space. In that silence, I heard the ticking of the clock, the breathing of my dog, the creaking of the old floor, and my own heartbeat, calm, steady, without tension. There was a time I was afraid of moments like these. They made me feel exposed. As if the world stopped distracting me, and I was left alone with everything I tried to hide inside. But now, I don't hide anymore. I've learned to be alone. And it turns out, there's nothing terrifying about solitude when you're actually present in it. When you haven't run away, haven't dissolved, haven't lost yourself. I left the house with no plan, no destination, no meetings, just walking and listening. The city felt different, too. Not loud, not intrusive, It was breathing too. Alongside me, I watched people laughing, someone holding someone else's hand, a mother adjusting her child's scarf. And I didn't feel pain, didn't feel envy, didn't ask, why not me? I was simply a witness to life. And that was enough. Because now, I had something of my own. Not external, not fragile, but internal, like a spring that doesn't dry up. I had myself. These days, I no longer tell myself, you'll survive. Because I don't need to survive. I just need to live. And allow myself to exist. Not as someone strong, not as someone perfect, but as someone real. In the evening, I turned off the lights. The room filled with half-darkness. The night city glowed outside the window. And within me, silence. A silence no longer filled with fear. A silence no longer tied to loneliness. A silence that breathes with me. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I know that whatever happens, I'll remain with myself. And this time, I won't run, because I've learned to be alone, and I'm no longer afraid of silence.